Yes, I can see you, but
Okay,
you're on
yeah,
mute.
I was
Hey,
muted. Can you
yeah,
hear
how
me
are you
now?
doing?
Hi, I'm doing well, and you?
Let me actually just show my screen so that you can see me as well. Thank you so much for
Ever.
taking the time. We just had our first session a couple of minutes ago, and as you agreed with the organization, this will be a Q&A session. So basically, we have some questions from the public already that I'll be sharing in the IM window and sharing with you as well. And if we have time, we'll be also getting questions from the audience, right? So and
Awesome.
maybe just to start, we would love to really hear a couple of notes from you from your history, and especially what were the main drivers behind the creation of Python, right?
Uh, yeah, the main drivers behind Python. I created Python when I was, hmm, let's say about 35 years old.
Wow.
I had been working as a programmer for probably 15 years at that point. If I get the chronology right, and I was a very experienced programmer, and one of the projects I had worked on for several years was the implementation of a different programming language that was designed by some of my senior coworkers. That language was never successful. It was named ABC. Uh, the next thing that happened was that uh, I was working on a different project, developing a distributed operating system, developing applications for that operating system. And I found that I was unhappy with programming in C. I was a very experienced C programmer, but nevertheless, coding in C was very slow and error prone. Uh, and so I sort of decided to combine that experience with the my experience building that ABC language previously, or at least participating in the construction of ABC. And I thought I designed my own language, which would improve my productivity, and which would also use the lessons I had learned about implementing languages and language design and some specific language design ideas from ABC. And I started this sort of as I was kind of bored during the Christmas holidays in 1989, and I worked on it for much of my time, especially my free time in 1990, and then in 91 uh, I released it as open source, and it immediately became successful. And that is sort of the origin story of Python. Oh yeah, and for I don't know if everyone here knows this. I chose the name because I was a big fan of Monty Python's Flying Circus, which is a very silly but very funny British comedy show, of course.
Great. I believe some of the folks here heard the story from your most recent videos on YouTube. So maybe I'll start right away with the questions that we already have. So there's someone asking here, what is your advice for those who don't code in Python, and what can we expect from Python in the next 10 years? That's a long time frame, but
Okay, that's a big essay question.
yeah.
So what is my advice for people who don't code in Python? I'm not sure how to interpret that question. If you're coding in a different language, go find a small Python tutorial on the web. There are many free Python tutorials that are available, some in video form, some in text form that you can download or just read on the web and follow along. if you're new to programming altogether and you want to learn programming, Python is a very good language to start learning to program. Again, there are many different tutorials that you can find. When you're a sort of new to programming, you should choose a different tutorial. You should choose something for absolute beginners. Okay, what can we expect from Python in the next 10 years? That's a tough question for me. I am bad at sort of predicting the future. 30 years ago, I would never have expected that Python would become so big that I would basically make a living of Python itself, and that I would be here answering questions about it to a group of people I would never meet in a faraway country.
Yeah.
Sorry. What can we expect? Python will continue to be one of the main languages used in data science and machine learning. We can probably expect at some point someone to develop a faster Python interpreter that can be used for those applications. But I don't know exactly who is working on, but I expect that if we're looking 10 years in the future, something like that is bound to happen, because there are people interested in doing that kind of stuff, and there are people demanding more speed from Python. We'll also see Python in general develop more features in support of those fields without losing touch with its history, which is more the web databases, user interfaces, and scripting.
Yeah, of course.
I think that's all I can say right now.
Yeah, it's really hard to predict, and this is somehow connected to the next question, which says, how did you know that the Python programming language and the community around it was prepared or mature enough to go on without you? This is coming from Giovanni. Yeah.
Interesting way of asking that question. Yes. I think that over the past 20 or 30 years, a number of people have popped up in the Python community and stuck around who are very skilled at sort of developing Python features themselves, and who have sort of shown that their way of thinking is similar enough to mine that I think they will sort of take the language in a good direction. So basically, I wasn't even 5 years ago, I wasn't doing most things alone. I was very much supported by a community, and the sort of various leaders and just leading lights of that community were strong forces and enabled me to take a step back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, there's a similar question to that one, asking you, why did you leave the Python project? Thank you. I think if you want to comment on that, feel free, Guido. But
well, I haven't completely left, as you might have noticed. Why did I retire as BDFL? It was because I was basically experiencing a burnout. I had been the sort of the focal point, the place where the buck stops, the final arbiter for so many conflicts, and also the focal point of so many attacks that I just needed some peace and calm in my life. Okay. And yeah, there was a specific issue that sort of made me
Yeah.
decide fairly suddenly, this is it. But that sort of, it had been leading up to that for a really long time. So probably for a few years, I would say.
Can we say that after feeling that burnout, your move to Dropbox was basically like your pivot from that bad energy, if I can say?
Uh, I wouldn't say that. Actually, I was already working at Dropbox
Okay.
at the time. Uh, I would say that my day job at Dropbox was also not free of stress, and probably to some extent added to the feeling of being burned out. Another thing is that sort of small health issues started to accumulate. I'm 64 now. When I retired from Python, I was 62, and it sort of, I felt I'm old. I've been doing this. I've been doing Python for nearly 30 years. I've been a programmer for 40 years, more than 40 years. I'm tired.
Yeah, that must be tiring. There's another question. What were the biggest challenges you faced when developing the Python programming language? Antonio Madeira.
I can interpret that in different ways. One big challenge has always been to sort of make different groups of Python users happy. I remember in the early 2000s, there were two common series of complaints about the language, and one of the series of complaints was, we need more features. Python needs to work in this context. Python needs to support that programming model. And at the same time, and sometimes from the same people, there were complaints, Python is changing too fast. We need stability. We don't want to have to worry about upgrades to newer Python versions. You're adding too many new features. So that sort of, those are complementary, contradictory forces in the user community, and it's difficult to sort of make everyone happy. Add some features without sort of the language turning into a random collection of unconnected features, and sort of make the language stable enough that people who don't want to follow every upgrade don't get too many surprises. I would say the other big challenge, if you're looking at sort of a specific challenge, was definitely the Python 3 transition, which we had planned as a much quicker, simpler, less traumatic event, but which in the end was sort of spread out over easily 10 years of the language's lifetime. And that was due actually to an odd mistake. When we planned the transition to Python 3, we didn't realize how successful the language already was. Mm-hmm. We thought that there was a small number of Python users who were big fans of the language and who were looking forward to sort of this new version of the language that we were rolling out. In fact, what we found was that there was a much larger group of Python users who were not very vocal, but who also didn't have interest in migrating all their code to a new, somewhat incompatible version, and who just stuck to Python 2 forever.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, I can tell that with some level of certainty that the majority of the people in the audience are young programmers. And this brings the next question coming from Bruno. Bruno is asking, besides acquiring knowledge in fields related to programming, what other knowledge can a programmer acquire to be a successful developer nowadays, especially? Yeah.
Well, one important thing to understand is that programming is not a sort of an individual sport. You can't do programming on your own anymore. You have to work as part of a team, and so people skills, social skills, knowing how to be a good team member, uh, knowing how to become a good tech lead, team lead, those things are very important. That was not something that I sort of knew much about when I got started, to be honest. I sort of really had to work hard to sort of become the community leader that Python needed.
Great. Well, there are questions related now to the earlier years of computer science. And Alexandre is asking what areas in computer science or what problems in computer science would you work if you could go back in times during your 20s and 30s with the same knowledge that you have now?
Oh my.
That's a good one.
If I could go back, what
What
do you
areas in computer
first time
science would you
problem
work
could
on?
could I work on?
Yeah.
I would definitely start working on networking in those days, because sort of the internet made all the difference for Python. It gave us a way to distribute our source code. It gave us a way to connect to our user community. It gave us a way to manage our source code through things like GitHub. And the internet sort of came, it took a long time to come to enough people. If I had better networking between computers in the 80s, things would have gone very differently. So I think that was a fundamental problem that not enough people at the time, I believe, were looking into. And I think it would have been a super interesting project to sort of be working with a group of people who sort of birthed the internet.
Yeah, yeah. And that I believe is a great segue for the next question, which kind of asks you to look to the future. What do you think would be the people that want to build programming language for the future? What type of tips or what type of things should they be thinking about from your experience?
People who want to build their own programming languages. My first piece of advice is always don't waste your time on a new language. Contribute to an existing one, because new iPhone apps get born at a rate of probably several hundred a day, but new programming languages get born at a much slower rate, and they get accepted at an even slower rate. It's really hard to convince people to use a different programming language than the one they're already used to using. And it takes an enormous amount of developer energy to design and implement a language and then promote it. Because it's one thing, I mean, a friend of mine who is probably much smarter than me designed his own programming language, built a compiler for it and a runtime, and at the end of the project was so exhausted that he never managed to sort of release it and find users. And that's sort of the danger of setting your aim at sort of building your own language.
Yeah.
It's good to know compiler technology. That's still a very useful thing. So learning how compilers work, how parsers work, how code generators work, how optimizers work maybe, is useful, because a successful language often ends up having many different implementations. There are lots of different C compilers around. Also, there's many successful new languages that have popped up in the last decade or so, or several decades, I would say, were actually designed by people who learned their trade by building compilers for existing languages. And in a sense, that's my own story too. My first project was help implement a language that someone else designed. If you look at C, I think C# is a good example. It was designed by someone who originally was the designer of, I think, the Turbo Pascal or Turbo C compiler at Borland. I may have the details of that story wrong, but that's definitely someone who was a compiler builder before he designed a language. The same is, say, Go came from someone who had worked on languages in a different context before.
Yeah. Thank you, Guido. We opened the floor for questions from the audience, and some of them are already popping up. Let me say, okay. The first one is coming from Ignacio. He's asking, what advice do you leave for new Python developers? I believe this is a very generic question, but Guido, feel free to comment on that if you like.
Advice for new Python developers.
Exactly.
Find a good web resource that where you can read about sort of intermediate Python functionality. It's easy to find tutorials. It's not hard to find references, but sort of stuff that gets you from a beginner to an intermediate, and then from an intermediate to an advanced programmer, you have to sometimes search around a bit. I can't really recommend any single book. I can recommend a popular website, realpython.com, has lots of blog articles about various things that are new and exciting, and also sort of
Tutorials, right?
Yeah, tutorials for stuff that where the standard documentation is maybe adequate, but not very enticing.
Yeah, it's just going through the examples and so on.
Don't just use Google and find web resources, and don't click on the advertisements.
Of course. Great one. So there's someone here involved, it's Guilherme, is involved with machine learning and data science, and he had contact with the Scikitlearn library. So he's asking how was the community evolved on that, and what can be expected from the future of that, I would say, of that library specifically, if I can say.
I'm not a machine learning user myself. It's something that maybe I ought to try to figure out how it works, how it's done. I mean, occasionally I talk to people who know a lot about that field, and they very quickly talk about things I don't actually understand, batch size and width and height and channels, and I wonder, oh, what are all these things? So unfortunately, I know it's a successful community. A successful community often has a main communication channel, some mailing list. I don't know what that is in the case of Scikit-learn, but I'm sure you can find it and join it and sort of listen to what kind of things people are talking about and learn that way.
Of course. Yeah, and some of the questions really are a bit broad. Bruno asking if someone should focus on programming logic or in learning a programming language syntax. I will pass this one because this is broad, and I believe the community can answer that. leverage Guido's time for Python related questions. So there's another one. So what is the implication that artificial intelligence such as GP3 will have in software development, and what is the best way to prepare for the complete integration of such technologies in the market? I don't know if you got this question, Guido.
I can say something about artificial intelligence. I have a feeling that it's highly overrated. What is currently called artificial intelligence is not really all that intelligent. It's a tool, but the machine learning is really not the same as artificial intelligence. And if you see how things work that sort of claim to be able to answer all possible questions, they're actually very simple, and they don't exhibit any real intelligence, because it's just like that IBM has this demo that can answer any question you ask it, but really it just has memorized all of Wikipedia, and it has some pattern matching, but it doesn't even really understand language, and it doesn't understand reasoning. So it's all very shallow, and I don't think that is going to change anytime soon. The sort of the robots from the science fiction novels from the 50s still are a very long way away, and I wouldn't sort of worry much about that. Self-driving cars are probably where it eventually is going to happen, because they sort of, their intelligence, human intelligence, is not just a brain that thinks about itself. It's very much connected with our senses in our body. And so a self-driving car is something that also has senses, and it can affect the world in certain limited ways.
Yeah, I have a question here from Fernando Ferroxnet. I actually had that question when I started learning Python. It says, in programming, indentation usually so in programming, indentation is usually used to improve the readability of code, right? But in Python, it's required for the scripts to run properly.
Right.
Was that a design, or what was the design decision behind it? And what were the advantages of it?
That was already present in ABC. It's one of the many ideas I stole from ABC, but the sort of, it came from a very specific experience where I had C code where you need to use braces to tell the compiler what the grouping of your code is. And a common programming mistake in C is to not use braces because you only have a single statement, and you indent that single statement and everything is fine. And then someone else comes along and they add a second statement, but they forget to add the braces to group themselves together. And now you have code where the indentation makes it look one way, but the compiler interprets it differently because the braces aren't where they should be. And you have a bug that is very hard to find for humans. There was a security bug in some Apple product a few years ago that was quite nasty, that was due to this. So in Python, you cannot make that mistake because you cannot have that bug in your code because the indentation is understood by the compiler.
The compiler, yeah, that's a great one. So there's another one relating to the ins and outs of the language itself. How is memory managed in Python? You can give a very high level description.
Yeah, basically all Python objects, even integers, live in what is called heap space. Almost nothing lives on the stack. And the primary way of managing memory, at least in the CPython implementation, is using reference counting. That means every object has a counter that is increased for every time there is a pointer to that object, and decreased every time a pointer sort of stops pointing to that object. And when the counter goes back to 0, the object is deleted. for various reasons, we also have an additional garbage collector that sort of occasionally looks through cycles of objects, looking for objects that all point to each other, but have no longer have any links with the rest of the object world.
Yeah.
It's a complicated topic. It's hard to answer in 2 questions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. That's.
But reference counting plus garbage collection is the sort of the best answer.
The basics. Yeah. There's another one which is very interesting. Since Python is very mature for development in general, what is missing for it to also enter in the mobile market with strength? It's something that comes quite often.
Yeah, Python on mobile devices. It's not anything in the language that's missing. It's an active policy by the owners of the mobile platforms to discourage other languages than the language they recommend. So Apple recommends Objective-C, and for modern code, Swift, of course. And Google recommends Java and Kotlin for Android devices. And those are the only 2 mobile platforms. And they're very, very tightly controlled by the hardware vendors, or by Google in the case of Android. And it's really difficult to break into that. I remember when I worked at Google many years ago and was worried about this same idea, I finally got the head of the Android division, and Andy Rubin at the time, to read my email, and he answered it with like 1 short sentence that came down to, Python will never run on this platform.
Yeah.
Just because he didn't want it.
Gotcha.
And not much has changed. I mean, there are people quietly working on porting Python to mobile platforms. Beware is probably the best, but it's not a sort of a big business, and there are lots of things that are difficult.
Yeah.
So that is unfortunate.
Yeah. And it's also unfortunate that we only had 30 minutes. I don't know why the organization team only reserved 30 minutes for you, but maybe we will end with this question here, which I think is very relevant for the moment we are living in. The question says, what are the things that the Python community is doing with the language that are making you proud, especially things related to helping humanity go to Mars and fighting COVID-19 and some other human related aspects.
Oh my gosh, I wish I knew what all the great Python projects were. I know Python is used a lot in data science, and a lot of the data that we learn about COVID, Python has been used somewhere. I'm not aware of specific projects that you could contribute to that would make that better. I think it's often things like all the data is collected and then put through some Python script that runs in a Jupyter notebook. And researchers share Jupyter notebooks with each other to show simulations and things like that. The most exciting application of Python in science has probably been the picture of a black hole that was published 1 or 2 years ago. That was a really large project that thousands of scientists, physicists, cosmologists, astronomers worked on together. And all the data processing was done through Python code. So I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, Guido, and the last question from me, since I'm the moderator and I can moderate, is maybe if you could share some advice, 2 or 3 things for this young generation of Africans, young developers, which make most of the audience that we have here, things that you can share for them to leverage for the future. not only looking into how we are living now, like with COVID-19, but what the future holds for Africans and for the world in general.
Well, COVID-19 is a temporary setback. I'm not enjoying it much myself. I can only imagine how it affects you all. Use the time that you're stuck at home to work hard, learn hard, and connect to your friends and make new friends, because you can connect to friends online and you can make friends online, and it's important to have people around you. So don't forget that, even if you can't go out and go to a bar and drink like you wanted to. And remember, it will be over, and sort of study and work and connect, and you'll come out with a good head start. That's the best recommendation I can give. And
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time. It was really a pleasure having you here. I believe we will collect the other questions and try to answer them as much as we can, and if possible, we will forward some of them to you. And I hope you have a great day.
All right. Thank you very much. It's been great being here. I'll go continue my day.
Thank you, Guido. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Take care.